Topicality is most certainly not a voter in PF. Topicality, which is commonly abbreviated T, is an argument in policy and in LD that says the affirmative side should lose if they do not present a plan that affirms the topic, because maybe it doesn't fall under the definitional limits of the text of the resolution. In PF, there are no plans. Sides are not called affirmative and negative, it's pro and con. And the pro side, which is the closest equivalent to the affirmative, does not always speak first in the round. The con can go first. As a result of these three pieces of evidence, I think it's totally reasonable to conclude that the topicality argument in policy and LD at least does not translate one-to-one to PF. In PF, there is still a topic, right? There's a resolution. Both sides are supposed to debate about that topic, which does beg the question of the definition of the words that are in that resolution and the most accurate way of interpreting them. If the topic is about nuclear energy, for example, and one side makes an argument about why it would be a great thing if the US federal government gives everyone ice cream, the most obvious response would be this has nothing to do with the topic, therefore it does not help you win the round. In other words, it doesn't function as offense. However, because policy is an older debate event than PF, and because the argument that's called topicality originated in policy, I think a lot of PFers have started copying the same type of arguments and have attempted to apply them one-to-one in PF. In policy, the affirmative side can only advocate for their plan, and the negative side has a burden of rejoinder. The plan functionally becomes the topic that is being debated in the round. As a result, a rejection of the affirmative's plan as being non-topical is the same as a rejection of the affirmative team as a whole, and one argument for why non-topical plans should be rejected is because they're unfair, since they determine all of the negs ground in the round as well. PFers have started using the same reasons. For example, in doubles of the TOC, J.R. Masterman WE read a topicality argument against Fairmont SS that said advocating for nuclear energy in space and in submarines are both not examples of domestic nuclear energy. In PF, I think these arguments just don't make very much sense because neither side's ground changes based on the arguments made by the other side. So I think it doesn't make sense for J.R. Masterman to use this as offense, to say you should drop Fairmont for reading non-topical positions. I think Fairmont SS is not advocating for putting nuclear reactors in space or on submarines. There's a slight difference, but an important one. Instead, they're saying it's a likely consequence of the resolution. If one side presents an argument that is not a pro or con of the resolution, that just means it's not a likely consequence of the resolution. It's not being unfair, it's just being unstrategic. And I think that rejecting the argument is not the same thing as rejecting the team that's reading it. The team reading the argument about space is not saying the entire debate needs to be about nuclear energy in space now. They're just misinterpreting how expansive the ground under the original topic was. If the word domestic in the topic does not, in fact, include space, for example, that just means the argument doesn't apply in the debate because the debate is about the topic by definition. This is defense. Maybe there are arguments about why counting a non-topical position would be unfair, but most of the time in PF, the other team is not arguing that you should count their position even if it is non-topical. They're arguing that it is not non-topical. Dropping the team for one position that was accidentally not a pro or con of the topic just seems like the same thing as dropping them for like a position that was found to be totally false because you responded to it. In PF, topicality makes sense as a reason to drop the argument, but not a reason to drop the team. I think the most accurate interpretation of a topicality shell in PF is not like teams must not read non-topical positions. I think it's also not like this new meta. The neg need not rejoin the AF, right? This is also still rooted in policy and LD structures that don't apply to PF. For example, the NSCA rules say that PF debate doesn't have burdens, which just makes logical sense because we have pro and con, not AF and neg. Instead, I think the most accurate interpretation of like a topicality shell in PF should be something like the judge should not evaluate offense from arguments that are not pros or cons of the topic. You could like soften the language of this to include theory offense, I guess. But I think that just makes the most sense as a defensive interpretation that is most accurate to the structure of PF. How about Ks though? This is the other big place where people might read T. I think these are slightly different. First, I think we need to be clear about like what we're talking about because there's tons of things that fall under the umbrella of what people call Ks. Topicality, to be precise, could be used against arguments that reject the resolution explicitly or support some method that falls outside of the topic, which is not true for all Ks. In cases where flouting the topic is intentional, and that's made clear, the other team is arguing for counting non-topical offense actively. I think using topicality as a theory argument with offense to drop the team makes sense. That's good. In cases where the K is pretending to be topical and it doesn't have like a defense of non-topicality. It just says we are topical. I think that topicality is defense. Functionally, maybe it still seems like offense because usually the entire position they have is staked on a central premise that might not be topical. And so like if you run defense against that, then like everything goes away. And so they have no more offense left. But that still doesn't make it offense, right? Technically, a K team could concede topicality, say that's defensive, and then go for like topical turns on your case out of rebuttal. One example that I think shows exactly why this is so intuitive is imagine a team accidentally reads a pro case on the wrong topic. They thought we're still debating AI in education, but it's April. The judge says they're not allowed to restart even after they realize their mistake. I think it's reasonable for them to stand up in the next speech and say, yes, we messed up. Our case was not topical. We never claimed that you should have to answer it or that you have to go for offense about AI in education. We're happy dropping it. And then they can just go for turns and rebuttal, try to scrape their way back into the round. To me, that seems totally fair. I think it would be illogical for them to lose on a topicality shell under these conditions. This also, interestingly, I think technically implies that in at least some K rounds, there is a legitimate argument to be made that the team running the non-topical K can make against the other team if they're only going for T. Like if one team is collapsing only on T, technically they're not extending any offense. So there's a presumption ballot to be made. Like the team running the non-topical K could say, hey, T is defensive. Even if you believe T, that means we have no offense, but they have not extended any offense, which means that neither of us have any offense, and maybe there's a way to presume. However, presumption is also really weird. It's like a specifically strange concept in PF that we can unpack in another video. Thank you for watching.